Good evening, everybody. My name is Betsy Fisher-Martin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. And welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. And whether you're watching on Crowdcast or Facebook Live, we are glad that you could join us this evening. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training and facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics. And for the last several years, we have also been fortunate to have a research partnership with the nonpartisan Barbara Lee Family Foundation that we call Gender on the Ballot. We have an active blog, and we have done research on topics like women's political participation, as well as the issue of electability when it comes to female candidates. And all of this has been along with the help of our friends at Benenson Strategy Group, who conducted this new poll for us that we're going to talk about called She Votes, the Workplace and Pandemic Politics. Women, the Workplace and Pandemic Politics, I should say. So basically, we wanted to explore how this pandemic has influenced or changed women's political engagement and policy priorities, and get a sense about some of the other areas regarding women in politics, like their views on women's representation and the impact, of course, of having our first female vice president. So reporting on so many of these issues has been the news site, The 19th. And for those of you who are not already familiar with their work, you should be. They are an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. And we're pleased to have also with us tonight their co-founder and editor-at-large, Errin Haines, who wrote a story just yesterday about the research. So we're looking forward to talking to her. And also with this is my partner in crime on Gender on the Ballot, Amanda Hunter, who was recently promoted to the executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation. Welcome, Amanda. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
And here to take us through the research and, of course, add her insights from many years of political polling is Katie Connolly, who is the senior vice president of Benenson Strategy Group. So welcome, Katie. I want to let everybody know before we start that we're going to take some questions at the end. So please feel free to type in a question in the Ask the Question queue at the bottom of your screen. And you can also upvote other people's questions that you're interested in. And if you would like to share this discussion with friends or replay it later, it'll be available at the exact same link that you used to register. So with that, welcome everybody. Glad that you're here. So Katie is going to take us through a deck. I'm going to share our screens in a second here and take us through some of the findings of the research. So let me share the screen, and Katie, I'll just advance as we go. And if I'm too slow for you, just tell me to move along here.
You'll never be too slow for me.
Hopefully everybody can see that. Katie, why don't you take it away?
Great. Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here on a panel with these incredible women, and looks like a huge and exciting group of people that have joined us. So thank you all for being here to go through this research today. So really quickly, we might just go to the next slide, Betsy.
Yep.
We conducted a poll from February to March 1st among 809 women. Every woman in this survey was somebody who voted in 2020 and is likely to vote in 2022. So really focused on women voters here. Want to keep going?
Yeah, hold on. There we go. Political lay of the land. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so we're just jumping right into the numbers here. And the first section we're going to look at is just some of the political views and the way 2020 played out for the women that we spoke to in the survey. Look, an unprecedented number of women told us in this survey that the 2020 election was the most important election they had voted in their lifetime, in their view. We had 51% of people say that, compared to when we did a very similar study in November 2018. And admittedly, you know, that was a midterm election rather than a presidential election. But there was a lot of sort of hype and interest in that election as well. Only 15% of women said then that that was the most important election, and now we've got 51%. Another one of the answers that they could have selected on this question was more important than most, and 36% of people said more important than most. So that's, 80, nearly 90% of women saying this is the most important election. The other thing that was interesting here is that women were really dug in. They decided well before election day what they thought about these candidates and who they were going to vote for. It was 62% of people saying that they had decided who they were going to vote for 6 months before the election. 62% of women, not people, rather, which is a really large number, leaving a very small group of people who were truly persuadable in those last few months of the election when a lot of the campaigns are really gearing up.
And Katie, let me interrupt you for 1 second just to let everybody know. If I know the numbers might be a little small on your screen, you'll see a green bar at the bottom of your screen, and that'll take you to a landing page where you can see this whole entire deck later, bigger if you want. And then also at the bottom of your screen, just the you'll see our little head boxes that are taking up the bottom. So I just want to point that out, Katie. If there's anything important that's at the bottom of the slide.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I just realized that. But if I make it smaller, it's going to be too small for anybody to read. So just FYI on that. But go ahead.
Well, if I buried something important on the bottom of the screen, then that's my bad. Right. Shouldn't have put it there in the first place.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Let's keep moving.
Next slide. Yeah. Here we go.
Thank you. So we also asked people, with these women, what were the issues that were really important to you when you were deciding who to vote? And very unsurprisingly, the pandemic came out on top with 42% of women selecting that. They were given a choice of 3, and that was the thing that they said was one of the 3 most important things. The economy came in a very, pretty close second there. Opposition to Trump was a big animator for women, and then healthcare. And interestingly, Joe Biden's, really main theme of his election campaign, which was bringing the country together, was a very important motivator for 20% of people. Now, we had a very, very big, long list. Other things that you may have wondered about: government spending, freedom of speech, foreign policy, abortion, guns, all of those things fell way down to the bottom of this list. And these are the things that were up the top, really animating women. We also asked a forced choice question where we wanted to say, putting the COVID pandemic aside for a moment, looking forward, what do you think the Congress and president really should focus on? We only gave them 2 options. And one option was economic issues like increasing wages, creating jobs, making healthcare and drugs more affordable, or addressing some of the more social issues that we talk about: racial injustice, police brutality, gender inequality, discrimination, gun violence. And really overwhelmingly, women opted for those bread and butter economic issues, with 73% saying that's what they would like the Congress and president to focus on, versus just 27% saying to focus on the others. Now, that is not to say that those issues are not important to women, but in a forced choice situation where they really want a priority clearly articulated by our leadership, it is the economic issues that shape their day-to-day that is really what they want to see a focus coming out of Washington and coming out of state houses around the country. So if we keep going. Mm-hmm. So Vice President Kamala Harris, obviously a very important figure for a group of women voters, and both of the institutes represented here. And clearly she was a real factor in people's votes and how they decided to, who to pull the lever for. 55% of women said that Kamala Harris was a factor in their vote. That's much higher among Biden voters, obviously, with 68% of Biden voters saying that she was a factor in their votes. Women also found the election of a female vice president to be exciting. We asked this question in 2 ways. Regardless of who you voted for in the presidential election, is having either in one group of women got a woman vice president and another group's got a Black and South Asian woman vice president. Is it exciting or, not exciting, basically? And we got essentially the same answer, the same number out of both of those things, which is 64% of women said it was exciting to have a female vice president, and 62% said it was exciting to have a Black and South Asian woman vice president. What's interesting here to me is that even Republicans found this exciting, which unusually, a lot of the times those kind of representational issues are less compelling to Republican voters. But at least 1 in 4 Republican voters said that it's exciting to have this in the White House for the first time. Numbers also much higher among women of color and much higher among Democrats. We want to keep going? Great. We also asked women, do you think there's enough women in office? And we asked a 3-point scale. Are there too few elected women in office? Are there about the right number? Or are there too many? Which, we didn't really expect many people to say too many. But 55% of women, when you looked at the total number overall, said there were too few women in elected office, with only 37% saying about the right number. And when we dug into this, we saw a real clear partisan divide on this issue, where Democrats and independents generally believe there are too few elected women in office, 73% of Democrats, 61% of independents. But that number dropped to just 27% when we were looking at Republicans. So they seem to be sort of a bit of an outlier on this measure, with 58% saying it's about right. So overall, if you look at women, just zoom out and look at the top line there, really a majority think that there aren't enough women in elected office, but that is very much driven by your political viewpoint, with Republicans really thinking it's about right. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to jump into a big section of questions that we asked about COVID-19, because obviously that is the topic du jour and that is the reality that we are all living in. And we wanted to dig into women's experiences and how this has affected their views and their political outlook. So we saw some really staggering numbers around the mental health toll that the pandemic has taken on women. We asked folks, would you say that the situation with COVID-19 has affected your health a great deal, some, not much, or not at all? And fully 60% of women said that it has affected them a great deal or some, with 71% of women under the age of 40 saying it has affected their mental health. And so that's an enormous number of women out there that have had some kind of negative impact in terms of their mental health because of the past year. We also asked people whether they'd felt more lonely, and fully 51% of women, so half of women, said that they have felt more lonely than usual over the past year. So we are dealing with, a country and women in this country that are really struggling with a lot of mental health impacts from what has gone on over the past year with, isolation and social distancing and just the upending of life as we know it. Do you want to jump into the next one? We also wanted to understand a little bit about their relationships. Has this affected how they're dealing with their family, how they're dealing with friends? And 1 in 3 women, a little bit higher than that when we talked about friends, have said to us that the relationships with their close family members have become either strained or distant. 39% say that among their close friends, their relationships have become strained or distant as a result of the pandemic. Interestingly, we saw much higher numbers again among that younger cohort of women, the 18 to 34-year-olds, nearly half of them saying that things have become strained or distant. We also saw higher numbers among women of color, 41% saying their family members' relationships have been strained, and 46% saying relationships with close friends, and then mothers with children under the age of 18. So, people who are really juggling that home and work situation, also feeling that their relationships have been damaged over the course of the past year. Financially, it's also been a real toll on women. We asked people over the last, since the pandemic began, has your personal situation gotten worse, gotten better, or not changed? 39% of women said it has gotten worse just in the last year. And among those who've said gotten better, just 18% of women said that their financial situation has gotten better. But what we're seeing there is that that's high income women. So people who are earning over $100,000 a year, mostly are the ones saying that their financial situation has gotten better. So people already at the top of the economic food chain have been reaping the benefits of the last year, while everybody else is either flat or really on a declining path in terms of their personal economic situation. We also asked people if they'd missed out on any career-related opportunities. And we asked this among women who are currently employed, but, were they supposed to be up for a raise or a bonus or a promotion because of the pandemic and didn't get one because of the pandemic? And overall, over a quarter of women have missed out on some kind of career opportunity like that. 28% saying that they did not get a raise, a bonus, a promotion because of the pandemic. And when we looked under the hood and dug in a little bit, that number jumped up to 43% among women under the age of 40. So again, that cohort of young women being really affected by the pandemic. And among mothers with kids under the age of 18, again, those people who are doing that juggling act, I know I am, 45% have missed missed out on some kind of opportunity for career advancement. These are staggering numbers, and this is going to have long-term effects for women over the course of the next few years as they try to get back into the workplace and regain their place in the workforce and try to get back on that trajectory. They've been knocked off it, and this is a significant issue for women going forward. We also had 25% of women, in addition to that, saying that they've had less work since the pandemic began, and you can see that being reflected in some of those economic numbers that we saw. We wanted also to look at, policies specific to women and things that they may have changed in terms of their economic views. Firstly, quickly, looking at vaccinations, we asked women whether they would likely get the vaccine, and over 80% of women did say to us that they would or have already received the vaccine, and a small proportion of women, 18%, said that they would not get vaccinated. What was interesting about these numbers, though, is again looking into who it was that was falling into each of these categories. In the I will not get vaccinated category, 18% overall, it's a much higher number among Republicans. 30% of Republican women said that they will not get vaccinated. 26% of women who live in a rural area said that they would not get vaccinated. So, outside of the cities and suburbs, a lot more skepticism. And we also looked at people who watch Fox News and conservative media, where we're seeing a lot more sort of negativity around the vaccine being promoted. And 21% of women who watch those news channels this will not get vaccinated. In terms of people who said, I intend to wait and see how things are going before I get vaccinated, we had about 29% of women saying that. But women of color were a higher number there, 38% saying that they will wait and see, a little bit more apprehensive. And in terms of people who've already been vaccinated, we saw a big racial disparity where white women were over 2 times more likely to tell us that they've already been vaccinated. So think compounding effects of both access to the vaccine and the way in which the vaccine is being distributed, and with white women potentially having more access, but also some of that attitudinal stuff around a little bit more apprehensiveness around some of the women of color wanting to wait and see if this is, if it's working, if there are any bad side effects and all of that. In terms of people who want to get vaccinated as soon as possible, unsurprisingly, Democrats are a higher number in that bucket, with 46% of Democratic women saying they're going to get vaccinated as soon as they can. We want to move over. Mm-hmm. We also asked them, these vaccine signups are hard. We're hearing all sorts of horror stories about people having to help others navigate these websites that are difficult and trying to get to the places of vaccination and all that sort of stuff. So we wanted to know, do women feel that they're taking more responsibility? And the overwhelming answer here was yes. We asked, as a general rule, who in your family usually takes responsibility for helping other family members do things like getting signed up for the COVID-19 vaccine? And we said generally women in your family or men in your family. 89% said women in their family. So, these are responsibilities that women feel fall squarely upon them, and that they are the caretakers in these families, and they are the ones really responsible for ensuring people in their social circles and people they care about get signed up for the vaccine. We also asked people about some of the issues that have come to light over the past year in terms of the disparities in how people are affected by COVID and their access to vaccines and their access to treatment. And we wanted to understand, are people concerned about this? And clearly, as you can see from these numbers, yes, big numbers of concern. Big numbers of women, 91% saying that they are concerned that COVID-19 has taken a much bigger toll on low-income workers and service industry workers. 87% saying they are worried that older Americans are having a hard time signing up for vaccines. 82% saying that COVID-19 has caused significantly more deaths and health issues in Black and Hispanic communities, and that's a source of concern of them. And you can just go down the list here, all of these elements of inequality that have been really exposed and really uncovered by the way COVID has played out in American life. We are seeing, very large majorities, near universal numbers here, saying this is concerning to them. Over on the side here, we've also pulled out the numbers among suburban women. And the reason that we did that was, A, the numbers are very high among suburban women, sort of mirroring these overall very high numbers. But as we know from 2018 and from 2020, these election cycles, suburban women are often the tipping point in a lot of elections. And going into 2022, those women are very likely to be the ones who are playing a really decisive role in a lot of key contests. We've seen over and over, it's the suburbs that are flipping, and it's the suburbs that are really sorry, I feel a lot of feedback all of a sudden. And it's the suburbs where we're really seeing a lot of change in how women are voting. And you can see here that these things are of real concern to suburban women. So my suggestion is that people who are up for election in 2022 would be very wise to take note of the fact that women find these the inequality that they're seeing around them really concerning. If you want to move on to the next slide. We also wanted to ask them a little bit about some policy implications. And of course, healthcare is top of mind. And we asked folks, do you agree or disagree with a couple of statements about expanding investment in healthcare and making women believe that we do need a better healthcare system? And we asked this in two ways. In the first way, we just asked more generally about the healthcare system. We said, the pandemic has exposed flaws in our healthcare system, and we need a better system. And we had 83% of women agree with that we do need a better healthcare system. But we also wanted to push a little further and really name check some of these government programs that we know in the past have generated a really sort of stark partisan divide. So we mentioned Medicaid, Medicare, and the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, to see, did they react differently when we mentioned specific healthcare programs? And there was a very slight drop off, 83% to 77%, but you were still getting 3/4 of women saying that these government programs, Medicaid, Medicare, and the Affordable Care Act, should be expanded because the pandemic has exposed the flaws in our healthcare system. These numbers were also very high among Republicans. So 62% of Republican women said that we should expand those programs. And among Fox News and conservative media consumers, again, the ones who would tend to be hearing more negativity around some of those programs, 70% agreed that they should be expanded because of what we've seen in COVID. So, the pandemic is really shaping people's attitudes, women's attitudes towards public policy and the role that governments can play in providing some of these resources. If we go to the next slide. Similarly, we asked about a couple of other, hot button policy topics that you see. The first one, we said, the pandemic has made me think that people who take care of our kids, the sick and the elderly, don't get paid well enough. 84% of women agreed with that. 83% of women said the pandemic has made me feel that we need more public investment in aged care and nursing homes. We've heard a lot over the past year about the inadequacies of our aged care system in dealing with generally coping with the stresses that they're under, but particularly in dealing with the pandemic. So big numbers of people concerned about that. And then lastly, the pandemic has made me more supportive of policies like paid sick leave and paid family or maternity leave. This has been a real issue, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle for the past few years, a lot of energy around paid sick leave and paid family leave. And now 80% of women say that they agree with supporting these policies. And these numbers, you can see over on the right-hand side of that chart, really hold up among conservatives. These are traditionally progressive issues, but what we're seeing is the center of the electorate really shifting and women sort of spearheading that change, and Republican women, Fox News viewing women agreeing with the expansion of all of these things: better pay, more investment in aged care and nursing home, and better investment in paid leave and family and maternity leave. So really a big shift here in how people are understanding the way in which governments and our leaders need to act and support Americans at this moment in time. If we want to move on. Caregivers, we wanted to look a little bit at mums. Full disclosure, I'm a working mum with a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, so it was sort of close to my heart. I've been doing that dance that I'm sure many of you have been doing over the past year or so of trying to juggle kids and doing things like this. So wanted to dig into that a little bit. And, this really rang true for me, probably rings true for a lot of people on this call, that mothers feel really conflicted about their new reality. They love that they get extra time with their kids, time that they wouldn't have had before when they're rushing to an office job or rushing out the door and shuffling their kids to and from activities. 86% of women said, though the pandemic is stressful, I love having so much more time with my children. So, a big sort of, value placed on being able to get that time with your kids and that face time and that family time. But at the same time, 60% of women saying, I cannot wait for my kids to get back in a real school. Both of these things can coexist in women. I think we all know this, that it can be a conflicting push and pull attitude. There's something really lovely about getting to spend more time with your kids. But wouldn't it be a relief if, they were back in school and you were able to sort of live your life the way that you were accustomed to? So, real competing tensions here in terms of how women are experiencing the pandemic. If we go to the next slide. It's been tough on mums. This is not news, no headlines here, but it's nice to see some numbers put behind it. 57% of women told us the pandemic has made caring for my children a lonelier and more isolating experience. So they're not feeling the support and the community that potentially they once had. Again, that number is higher among those younger mums, 18 to 34-year-old mums. 69% of them said that they're feeling lonelier and more isolated. If we look over on the other side of this chart, we asked whether this describes people well or not. The pandemic has made caring for my children more stressful because I can't ask the usual people I go to for help with watching them, like family, friends, nanny, or babysitter. 55% of women said that was the case. So you have, that lack of support structure feeding into this idea that it is a lonelier, more isolating experience for women. Again, when we dug into that number about not having the same support people, those numbers were higher among that 18 to 34-year-old cohort, 65%, and among women of color, 63% said that the pandemic has made it more stressful because they can't rely on those usual folks. If we go to the next one. School reopening has been a hot topic, and we're seeing a lot of differing views about whether people would want to rush back into school, and we do know from a couple of slides previous that women do want their kids going back to school, but they're wary about schools just reopening. We are seeing 69% of women in a forced choice. We asked them, which of the following comes close to your view. Fully 69% of women said, we still don't know enough about how kids get and spread COVID and what the risks for teachers are. So forcing all schools to reopen straight away would be the wrong move. So they are looking for, safety. They want to be assured of the safety of their kids and their teachers. And they're looking for sort of a considered approach here. Only 31% of women said the other option here, which is that kids don't seem to spread or get very sick from COVID-19, so we should make all schools reopen straight away. So that idea that, and we're seeing this play out politically a lot with a lot of, folks really pushing for schools to reopen. And what we're seeing from women here is, yes, I want my kids back in school. Yes, I want schools to reopen, but we got to do this safely and we got to do this the right way. If we want to move on. We also said, imagine if all the schools reopened tomorrow. And we asked this of women with kids generally. We didn't ask it of women who don't have kids. Imagine if all the schools reopened tomorrow and you had a choice. You could send your kid back to school or continue virtual learning until you felt it was safe. What would you do? And if schools reopened tomorrow, fully 64% of women, nearly 2/3 of women would say that they would continue virtual learning until they felt it was safe to go back. So they really are looking for that, reassurance, that idea that when they send their kids back, it's going to be to an environment that they feel comfortable with. Only 36% said they would send kids back straight away. We also asked, do they feel that virtual learning is working? And about 57% said, look, virtual school has not worked well for my child and they're happier in a traditional school. But that number was frankly lower than I thought it was going to be. We still had 43% of women saying that it has worked out well and they're happier and learning better at home than in a traditional school. I think that's a really interesting number, and there probably are kids, particularly, high school kids and kids who are a bit more self-sufficient, who are learning really well at home. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the future in terms of policy choices about how we decide to school our children and whether or not full-time school all day, every day is the right thing for every kid. Clearly, some mums don't think it is. Again, just a few more data points here about working mums finding it hard to juggle work and school. 54% of women said it's compromising their ability to work for their employer, having to manage virtual school. And 49% has said it's extremely hard for me to go to my place of work and feel confident my kids are being cared for because of virtual schooling. So this juggling act is tough and taking a toll. And again, just a couple more things. They're balancing responsibilities. They're saying, 1 in 3 have had to pass up opportunities at work, similar to what we heard earlier. But 55% of women, including 63% who work from home, are saying since the pandemic began, it has gotten harder than ever to balance caring for my kids with all my other responsibilities. So, this past year, as we all know, been very tough on working mums. And just our last section, just looking a little bit of more broadly at women in the workforce. Interestingly, working from home has not really created additional stress for a lot of women. Around 26% of women say that working from home has made their job more stressful, but 37% said less stressful and 37% said it's been the same. So really only about a quarter of women, higher obviously among women with young kids who they're probably having to juggle the work and school that we discussed, but mostly saying, that it hasn't actually been more stressful for them. And then when we said, when it's over, do you want to go straight back to working outside of the home? Just a quarter of women said that they want to go back to working outside the home. And fully 45% said, I would like to work from home permanently. And 30% said that they would like to have some flexibility to work at home and also work outside the home. So we are not seeing women, desperate to get back into the office, eager to get back into the 9 to 5. We also asked an attitude statement, do you agree or disagree with this statement? The pandemic has made me think that the old model of going to a workplace or office 9 to 5 with no flexibility is outdated and needs to change. 78% of women said, yeah, needs to change, it's outdated. So we're going to have a cohort of women when this is all over demanding better workplaces and more flexible workplaces, and employers who want to, retain that talent and attract those women into those jobs are going to have to take note of this and sort of rethink some of how they make their workplaces, the policies around how they make their workplaces operate. We also asked women, do they feel like their employer cares about them or cares about profits? And 35% of women said to us on an agree-disagree basis, I feel like my employer only cares about profits in this pandemic, not its employees. So about a third of women feel like their employer doesn't care about them. But when we looked under the hood again and looked at sort of different groups of women, 57%, that's over half of women of color, said that the employer cares only about profits and not about its employees. That's a devastating indictment of the employers of those women. And among the lower income women earning less than 50K a year, 42%. So, 4 in 10 women said that their employer does not care about them and only cares about profits. 27% believe that their employer has put them at risk. Sorry. Put them at risk of catching COVID-19. Again, those numbers are higher among lower income and younger women. And if we move to, I think this is the last one.
Yeah.
Yep. And though generally women have a really new appreciation for working mothers, 62% of women said it is seeing their co-workers care for children and work at home full time during the pandemic has given them a new appreciation for the difficulties of being a working mum. That's a big number there. Another 34%, honestly said, look, this is causing me extra stress and putting more work on my shoulders because they're having to work around the parenting demands of their co-workers. And that was higher, again, among that younger cohort of women. So yes, huge appreciation for what is happening with women and how hard it is to juggle all of that. But there's still a third of women who feel like more responsibilities are falling for them as their co-workers aren't able to keep up with the parenting demands. So that's it. A lot of stuff there to unpack, tons to talk about. Looking forward to hearing all your questions and comments.
Yeah, well, thank you, Katie. That was fascinating. And like I said, if anybody wants to go through that deck, it's all on the landing page on our Gender on the Ballot. So you should be able to find it there. Errin, let me go to you first because you wrote a piece based on this, and you were also very pressing it back in November about this impact of women and what they're thinking and how COVID 2016 certainly motivated women, right? Yep. But here comes 2020 and we've got this to deal with.
Absolutely.
As you look at women and their political participation and their policy preferences, what is your take from these numbers?
Yeah, well, look, I will tell you, Betsy, that even going into 2020, before the pandemic and everything that has affected women so much in the last year, going into 2020, women voters were absolutely motivated to participate in the 2020 election. Their energy and enthusiasm around this election was something that I saw, back when there was something such a thing as a campaign trail, out in on the primary campaign trail. You just saw women on fire and ready to participate and ready to kind of get into what a lot of them felt like was going to be at least the most consequential election that they had ever been involved in. And for women of color and other marginalized folks that I spoke to, I mean, they felt like this election was existential. And that was before the pandemic. And so that feeling was exacerbated, by the pandemic. And, just hearing from women over much of last year, what emerged was, that even though women were not necessarily being killed disproportionately by the coronavirus, in almost every other aspect, women were being disproportionately impacted by or responding to the pandemic. And so seeing that last year, on the ground and just kind of hearing from folks, in their homes and sharing with me their experiences, to see that quantified now in this polling is just really, really gratifying because, two of the things that I said last year going into November were one, that the pandemic was absolutely political for women in particular, and it was motivating how they were showing up at the ballot box. And two, that women were going to be the deciders of this election. And they were. And the pandemic, I think, largely drove that. If they weren't already motivated, they were absolutely determined to vote, even in the midst of a global public health crisis, because they were that eager to have their elected officials, and not just at the top of the ticket, really up and down the ballot. They were looking for folks who were going to respond and really help them get to a new normal as we look towards the recovery. Because what we know is that, this country does not get back to normal. This economy does not get back to normal without women returning to the workforce and really returning to society. But what they're saying, as this polling has shown, is that they are not willing to go back to the status quo. That they have learned that there needs to be a new normal for them, or it's just not going to be possible. And they just don't want to go back to some of the practices that we know, laid bare a lot of the inequalities that were there even before the pandemic.
Right. And to me, that 78% number, Katie, that you mentioned too, about, women saying the outdated sort of 9-to-5 model.
That's over.
And so, women are going to want some of those changes. But Amanda, let me ask you about, the other priorities that women voters want. And, as you look at this poll, what struck you in terms of that?
Gosh, well, thank you so much, Betsy. And one reason that Barbara Lee, my boss, started doing this work is because she's always said that women have been the vanguard of so many political movements, from the suffrage movement to the civil rights movement. And if anything, we thought that this may spur more women to run for office and more women to get politically involved. I think that this data kind of hints at that, based on how strongly women feel and the fact that we know that women often run for office when they're activated by something that's affected their family and their community. And it also shows that for so many years for women, the personal was political. And now there's a real opportunity for women in politics to connect their experience in and around this pandemic, to remind voters that they're in touch with their lives, that when we see women in Congress on Zoom working from home with their kids in the background, it's a reminder that they understand what so many other women are going through. And it's clear from our research that women voters' lived experience really matters for women leaders. And that's just another way, unfortunately, that a lot of women leaders have that in common with these women in the poll.
Yeah, and we talked about in the poll too, kind of women's representation and people's opinion on, how that stands. And then of course, having Kamala Harris as the vice president. What are your thoughts on sort of, can we expect sort of this momentum that we see, of course, a record number of women being elected to Congress? Can we expect this kind of forward momentum to continue? And what are the sort of the other challenges that kind of remain for women that are running for office? I know you all do a lot of research in this area.
Yes, absolutely. I think we will continue to see an upward trend of women being elected to office and running for office. Just hearing from our colleagues at organizations that train women, they're getting thousands of inquiries for women right now that want to run for office. And we saw that back in 2017 before a record number of women ran for office in 2018. It seems like, if anything, the tide is continuing to turn for women in politics. I think another important sign of the change that we've seen in our research is that a majority of voters agree and acknowledge that women in politics face sexism. And voters realize that sexism is not a weakness for women, it's a problem for everyone. And so if you look back over the past 5 years with the Women's March and the Me Too movement and just this change in conversation, this seems like yet another shift and hopefully the beginning of a barrier that will start to come down, that voters actually want to see women stand up for themselves in the face of sexism. And it's an opportunity for women when for years and years, for example, Secretary Hillary Clinton talked about early in her career learning that she needed to ignore sexism and pretended that it didn't exist. So that seems like another big shift that we've seen in our research.
Yeah, and one thing that didn't change, and Katie, we had done a poll in 2018 midterm voters, and we asked them about that question, that same question we had in this poll about women's representation and whether you think we have, too many women in Congress, not enough, or, oh, it's okay. And as you mentioned in the slides, we did see that kind of partisan divide in terms of Republican women. And this was the same that we really saw in 2018, basically saying, it's fine. We've got enough women in Congress. And of course, Democratic women and independent women saying, no, we don't have enough.
Yeah.
What strikes you about that in terms of, the attitudes and the party divisions? And when we talk about, trying to get more women represented in Congress, and if we have, members of one political party that don't see what the need for more equality, it's hard to do that, right?
Yeah, it's a huge impediment. And I think that, it's just the different nature of the conversation on the right versus the left, and the importance of representation, that on the left, we tend, I say we because I'm a Democratic pollster, so I'm not saying we as in the people on the screen, but me as a Democrat and as a Democratic pollster, we on the left, tend to believe that representation really matters, and it matters in terms of the issues that get brought up, it matters in terms of the policy prescriptions that are offered, and it matters in terms of the symbolism and what it does to empower groups of people to see folks like themselves in positions of power. On the right, that conversation doesn't really happen as much. That representation isn't sort of the same source of interest and desire. And part of that is that the Republican Party is more monocultural generally than the Democratic Party. There is less diversity, there are fewer women, and there is less priority placed on the idea that representation has all of these other impacts that are important and valued. It's not as much of a valued construct for them. And on that side of the aisle, it's far more about sort of orthodoxy to the certain set of ideas that they're pushing rather than the desire to elevate different and new voices.
And yet, Errin, we saw, a record number of Republican women being elected to Congress this cycle as well. And you've done reporting on that, I know.
Yes, well, listen, the recruitment may not have necessarily been there, but women were definitely absolutely motivated in these past couple of cycles to stand for office, regardless of ideology. You do have, women like Elise Stefanik, for example, saying, really being proactive about trying to recruit Republican women. And I think that she would say that some of her efforts had certainly paid off, but there were other Republican women who were motivated to stand for office, to get involved and run. But really, yes, I think to Katie's point, getting that infrastructure and having the, the backing of an actual, party system behind Republican women can help to remove kind of some of the barriers that we know exist, in terms of gender. When you see women wanting to run for office, but maybe, that kind of gets into the conversation that we have around electability, which we certainly are all about dismissing and dismantling at the 19th, because, frankly, people are electable when we elect them. And that should be the only criteria.
That we use. I remember, election day, your piece was like, being electable in 2020 was always about who women would elect, right?
Yes.
At the end of the day. But I also wanted to get your thoughts too, because you've done a lot of coverage about Vice President Harris.
Yeah.
And, we talked about that in the poll, women certainly feeling, that was a factor in their vote. Although, conventional wisdom states that, vice presidential, candidate doesn't matter in presidential.
Right.
How do you square those two things?
Well, it definitely mattered this year. And it mattered because we knew, as we saw this election taking shape, and it came down to, again, despite having the most diverse field of Democratic primary candidates, a record 6 women, so many candidates of color, it still came down to 2 white men in their 70s, right? And so women were just kind of like, it's one thing in 2016 to have one woman running and saying, oh, well, I would vote for a woman, but not that woman.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to 2020 and you have 6, and it's like, well, none of them were good enough for you either. So what are we really doing? I think there were a lot of women who were calling very early, the presumptive nominee, Joe Biden, to pick a woman. He said very early on in this primary, because he sewed up that primary so quickly, that he would choose a woman as his running mate. And so, I think that once that was established, you had women of color, in particular, Black women, the Black women who frankly propelled him to the nomination ahead of schedule, saying, look, we want to return on our investment here. You will value us not just for our output, but for our input. And we are telling you that you will pick a woman of color, a Black woman specifically, to run with you, or, we're still going to vote, because that is what Black women do. But, what they were saying to me is, that will really make the difference between whether we vote or whether we bring along our household, our community, our sorority, all of the networks and institutions that Black women tap into when they go to the polls, not only for themselves, but on behalf of, not just the race, but the community, their society, this democracy. Like, that is really how they approach this thing. And so I think, the addition of Kamala Harris on the ticket was something that energized and galvanized a lot of Democratic women, but women of color in particular, who saw in her not just symbolism, but somebody who might bring their lived experience in terms of substance to policy, in shaping, kind of what a governing agenda that reflected their priorities might look like.
Right. Amanda, did you want to weigh in on that Kamala question?
Well, I think just getting back to the electability piece too, we did some research in 2019 on electability, and we tested a number of hypothetical women candidates from a variety of backgrounds on both sides of the aisle. And every woman candidate that we tested either won or tied her ballot against a straight white man of the opposite party. So it really showed us that it was a tired myth that women aren't electable. And we know anecdotally that when women run, women win. So it's a lot of that naysaying that is harmful. I think what Errin was saying is so important about Kamala Harris and her lived experience, and the fact that she's bringing a completely different perspective literally to the table is so important to women and so important for policy, because we know from our crisis research, especially, that crisis really clarify, and voters know now what they want in a leader. And it's almost more important. They want somebody who listens both to experts and to voters, and that has a plan, someone that has empathy, and someone that really that won't just laser focus, that will take a broad view and think about populations that aren't as obvious to some of the older white men at the table. So I think that's a really great reason that a lot of voters were that much more excited to have Kamala Harris, and some of the women that have been appointed to positions at high levels in the Biden administration as well.
I want to get to a couple of questions. This one is from Julie, and she says, if women do succeed in moving away from a traditional 9-to-5 schedule after COVID, I'm concerned that this will perpetuate the gap between men and women in the workplace. And her question is, have you seen any similar data for men not wanting to go back to a traditional 9-to-5 schedule? Might this be a larger trend? Katie, have you seen any data? We didn't poll men in this survey, but have you seen any other data that affect?
So I haven't, and I almost think it's a little too early to say. Yeah. I think this is still a bit of an unknown, right? It really is depending on how leaders in corporate America and business of America decide to make workplaces inclusive and decide to create policies and ideas around how you can make sure that these gaps don't start to exacerbate. I will say, though, that I don't think the desire to work from home and the desire to have a more flexible workplace is exclusive to women, right? I definitely think that there are plenty of men. We didn't ask this particular question among men. I have seen some similar kind of questions in other research that suggests that men also are questioning this. I think because the responsibilities have fallen disproportionately to women, it's felt more acutely by women in the population. But I don't think that this is necessarily a viewpoint or a demand that will only be made by women workers.
Errin, what are your thoughts on that as we sort of look at sort of post-pandemic? We said there's a new normal, it's going to be, things are going to look differently, but what is that? What do you see as that kind of impact? And will there be sort of a gender split on some of these, preferences for work? And does that set women back in any sense, or if we move beyond that?
Well, Betsy, I think that it is going to be so important to continue to watch how the administration messages on this and how they kind of lead by example. They talk about wanting to really center racial equity, but I think gender equity also has to be a part of this piece. And the intersectionality of racial and gender equity. I mean, I think you saw in the pandemic relief package, so much of what they, were trying to address is going to directly affect not only, marginalized communities and people of color, but women. Thinking about the child care piece, thinking about, that earned income tax credit, lift children out of poverty, thinking about, the mental health, the gender-based violence, like all of these things that could change what life looks like for women, especially in terms of their workplace setting. I mean, obviously the $15 minimum wage didn't happen, which would definitely affected women and especially women of color, right? But even just in terms of knowing that the unemployment insurance piece, knowing how many women were essential workers in this pandemic, teachers, nurses, the frontline workers, those essential workers that we saw, many of those were women. And so, to have this signature piece of legislation that really reflects the realities of so many women in this country, I think that is something that, the corporate community can take their cues from if they choose to. It's certainly something that their employers can kind of point to and say, look,
right,
this government is addressing my reality. Why aren't you? And I think that is something that women, you're going to see them using their voice and continuing to be engaged, not only politically, but also in the workplace, because they do want this change, and if they're not raising these issues, it is not necessarily front of mind or obvious to many of the men who are in charge of running these organizations, right?
Right. Let me get to one other question here. Katie, this one is for you, from Isabel. She says, what was the most surprising finding from your research?
Oh, gosh. There's so many good nuggets in here.
There really were.
I think, to me, the thing that was really striking, and the numbers were so much higher than I had anticipated, were the agreement with those policy statements, the idea that women are more supportive of paid leave and maternity leave, that they want higher wages, that they want public investment in aged care. And in particular, naming those words that have so often in my research had such a partisan response. Medicaid, Medicare, the Affordable Care Act so often engender such a strong divided partisan response. And what we saw here was Republican women, Fox News viewing women, independent women, Democratic women, all lining up to say, these are important priorities. We demand that the government, that our leadership, that our lawmakers start to address these issues and start to make these investments because it's important and it matters. And the pandemic has laid bare the inadequacies of our current systems. And so to me, that sort of coherence across the partisan spectrum, congealing around these important public policy issues, which, in a lot of the coverage in the media, you sort of see them portrayed as, oh, that's the left, that's what the liberals want, that's what the progressives want. And what we're seeing here is that that's not the case. That is what all women want. And we're seeing the center of gravity in politics really shift towards an agenda that sort of demands, more investment in services that help women live the lives that they want to kind of lead, and that we fundamentally start taking care of people. You can talk about policies, but ultimately women want to see other people taken care of. And I think that the conformity across the partisan spectrum on that was really interesting to me.
And you know what, Katie, I think to your point, that is why you see so much bipartisan support for this pandemic relief package.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, and what's really interesting is, if you look at sort of ballot initiatives across the country, whenever these things are put directly to voters and taken out of that, partisan box, minimum wage passed in Florida with 60%, $15 minimum wage, paid sick leave passed in Arizona. We have like a Medicaid expansion passed in Utah, in Nebraska, like these places that are traditionally red states. And once you give voters the opportunity to say, do you want this public policy intervention or not? They say, yeah, absolutely. Give us the higher wages, give us paid sick leave. And what we end up with is this sort of partisan ideological struggle that is quite removed from the day-to-day experiences of women.
And Errin, I know you have a heart out. Is there anything you want to say? And we'll let you drop off because I know you have to hit something right at 7.
Yes, I want you all to continue the conversation, but unfortunately my MSNBC duties are calling me. So
and we want to thank you for your reporting and your insight into all this as well. So
thank you for continuing to amplify these issues, because look, we know that the pandemic is going to continue to be political for women, and to see really how they show up as candidates, as voters, putting their money into weighing in on these issues politically. I think that we're going to see that continue. The jobs plan we know is coming up next. Infrastructure, and trying to make a lot of what passed in the pandemic relief package permanent. I think that we could see women continuing to weigh in on all of these issues. And so, from both a governing and a participation standpoint, I don't think that we should expect to see women going anywhere. As busy as they are, they definitely have time to get involved in making sure that they help to create the new normal that they need to see before they can reemerge into this recovery that the rest of the country is so bent on moving towards.
Well, speaking of busy, we will let you drop off, and thank you. And Amanda, I want to ask you just a final thought, maybe just to pick up on that last question to Katie. Of what else jumped out to you in this poll? What was most surprising to you?
Gosh, I think like Katie was saying, the bipartisan support for a lot of the issues, that it really feels like we are at a critical moment in this country for women, and things have directly affected women in the home. And this is also something that certainly has disproportionately affected women of color. And there are definitely a lot of levels of privilege in this pandemic, but in some way, this pandemic has affected everybody. Everybody's being told to put on a mask. Everybody is dealing with some issues around things being closed. And so the universality is, I think, a big influence on the fact that there's such intense feeling around this. And it just seems like it's going to really motivate women in 2022 and beyond.
I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we kept hearing those stories like 2 months in about the people that had been like out to sea for 2 months and that they had no idea. And they looked at it and they were like, what's going on? But like, we were the only people, right, that were not touched by this.
Right.
So excited about sort of that universality of all of this as well. Katie, any parting words from you before we go?
Gosh, I feel like I've talked a lot. I think everyone's probably sick of hearing from me, but thank you.
No one's ever sick from hearing from you. I just want to remind everybody that, you can find more info on the poll and our Gender on the Ballot blog. I mean, like we said, there's so much here. So we're going to spend the next month doing a lot of different blog posts into the various topics. So, be sure to look out for that as well. And I want to let folks know about some of the other upcoming Women on Wednesdays that we have over the next 2 weeks. Next week, we are doing a discussion with Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes, two reporters who have just published a new book called Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. And so they will be here to talk to us about that. And then the week after that, we are doing a special to end out Women's History Month. We're going to have former Congresswoman Donna Shalala on, the former past president of American Medical Association and the executive vice president of the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, to talk about women, tobacco use, and sort of the road ahead. So that will be an interesting discussion as well. So we hope that you will join us for that. Let me just bring everybody back here. And thank you, Amanda and Katie, for your insights. Thank everybody for joining us tonight. And again, check out our the link on the page for more on the poll. And we'll hope to see you next week. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you.